Welcome to Graphic Policy Radio. We're going to be getting very populist in our Star Trek coverage today because it's time to talk about Lower Decks. Lower Decks. It is a show that we have not covered on the podcast before, and I actually was kind of slow to start watching it. I believe Sarah Rasher, who is my co-host for our Star Trek Deep Space Dive DS9 podcast, was also a little bit late to start the show as well. We've all really come to love the series, and today we're going to be focusing our conversation on the final season of the series, but I did want to sort of open up with a spoiler-free pitch to our listeners about why they might want to watch the show in the first place. And joining me to do that is John Arminio, frequent guest of the show, podcaster himself with Popcorn Eschaton.
Hey, Ilana. Yes, it's great to be here. Thank you.
Yeah. And I was realizing that as much as I associate all things Star Trek with you, because you have been a guest on so many Star Trek podcasts, you've not been on mine to talk about Star Trek yet. So if you wanted to give a quick peek into your relationship to the series at all, I actually think the first podcast with you that I listened to was you talking with Film 89 about the original Star Trek movie.
Oh, yeah, nice. Yeah, that was a great time. Was that like 2019? Good gravy. Yeah, so I've loved Star Trek as long as I can remember. My parents are big Star Trek fans, and so in a time when you only had one TV in the house, if they were watching Star Trek reruns, so was I. And I fell in love with the original series as a kid, and fell in love with the Next Generation. And as I have grown older, my relationship to Star Trek has grown. I keep finding new reasons to revisit it, new themes and ideas to interrogate and extract from it, both in good ways and in maybe some problematic ways with some of those older series. But I think because Star Trek had the courage to challenge itself and its audience with those ideas, it makes it worth revisiting. And I love that the franchise continues to change and adapt, and that includes an animated comedy show.
Yeah.
Would never have thought possible.
It's funny, this is the second animated Star Trek series, because there was the cartoon from the 70s, which I actually have not watched.
I like the animated series from the 70s. It does suffer from the sort of filmation animation style.
Yeah.
But a lot of the writing is very good. And I think because some of the original series episodes, were like 55 minutes long and maybe should have been 40. When you have that like half-hour format, it sometimes serves the episode better, actually, in the writing.
Well, I will tell that I love animation. My late friend Stephen Adwell and I had our Venture Brothers podcast, and we've covered animated shows quite heavily. It's funny that you mention the animation style from the old animated series, because to me, a barrier that kind of slowed me down from wanting to watch this series was the animation style, which is one that I associated a lot with Rick and Morty, because round eyeball on the stick character heads, even though, even seen at a distance, like this is clearly a more refined animation than that. It still was like, I was still frustrated because I would have preferred a more aesthetic, like, I'm not asking for anime or a specific style, but just something that was a little bit less Rick and Morty adjacent.
Yeah, I do not like Rick and Morty, and I was really afraid, especially because Mike McMahon was a writer on that show, creator of Lower Decks, that it would bring that sensibility and cynicism to Star Trek, which is not something that I'm looking for in
Star Trek.
Yeah, like this is one of the few franchises around that is brimming with hope and optimism. It says that like we can achieve a post-scarcity near utopia if we just like drop our BS and work together, right? And that's not the thesis statement of Rick and Morty at all.
No.
And we're in a weird place with animation right now in general, where a lot of shows that I think have good writing or good potential suffer from what I see as pretty poor animation. Mm-hmm. I think like Star Trek Prodigy has some great writing. It's a great entryway for young viewers into Star Trek, and it has some great voice acting, but I just cannot look at it. It looks like PlayStation 3 graphics to me.
Yeah, it's freaking heinous. I began watching it when I ran out of other Trek to watch, and I will say to our listeners, it is instructive to find that what Star Trek believes that children need in order to get interested in Star Trek is a show that is straight out of Star Wars animation. Like Prodigy is the most Star Wars thing that Star Trek has ever done. I enjoy Star Wars animation, but I was definitely a little bit like thrown by that. But yeah, the animation styles there's a lot of adult animation that they just sort of pump out on Netflix that has a very cheap look, and it's all the style is missing.
Yeah, and even like DC's Creature Commandos, like I see it using like the Hanna-Barbera tricks, like when the character's walking, it's not an animated walk, it's like going back and forth between two frames on a scrolling background.
Yeah.
Right? And this is supposed to be like a high-profile James Gunn produced and written HBO Max release, and is aesthetically boring at best.
So what we're saying is pay your animators.
Hell yes. Good grief.
Anyway, so despite all of these things that we just talked about not loving, like I came to love Lower Decks. And for me, I feel like it was probably episode 5 of season 1 before I was like, I like this. And then by the end of season 1, I was like, I really like this. And then by season 2, and actually we fucking love this show.
Yeah.
And what it took to get me in is the first episode I watched, was my friends were like, you got to watch the DS9 episode. Because yes, there is a DS9 crossover episode, which I know Sarah and I will be covering on the main Deep Space Dive podcast later, so we'll focus on that there. But it was the confirmation that the show acknowledged Deep Space Nine and was interested in some of the same things that Deep Space Nine is interested in, namely questions of how do we interact with other kinds of societies and the diplomacy and really the diplomacy questions of Star Trek. And the dedicated character growth, that was what made me say, this isn't just manic silliness. This is a Star Trek show.
And what I find interesting about Lower Decks and the crew of the Cerritos, at the beginning of the series, they sort of see themselves as like second tier Starfleet, right? You have your Enterprises and your Titans as the flagships, the crews responsible for first contact, and the Cerritos is responsible for second contact, right? To go in where we have like the caution cones lined up and clean everything up, right? Do the drudgery work. But as the show progressed and as the characters became more comfortable in their roles, it became clear that their mission is like the most Star Trek of missions, right? Their job is to solidify friendships and make the connections that are going to be permanent to make these newly discovered worlds like true parts of the Federation. Like, it may not be glamorous to be the ones like paving the roads and installing the plumbing, but they're the ones who are going to make life better for the people on these planets and allow them to be integrated into the galactic community. And I think that's a great, mission for a Star Trek show.
And at first I thought, actually, this is what it was. There are a number of things about this show that I thought the series was going to be treating as jokes that are things that I wanted in earnest. And as I began watching the show, I realized that the series wanted them in earnest also, right? So I've always wanted there to be a Star Trek show that was focusing on people who weren't in command. Like, that was about the people cleaning the ductwork and like, what is it like if you're not the special person? And it was like, haha, they're losers. And I'm like, why would they be losers? They're still in like Star Trek. They're still in these are not losers. They're just not, they're just people who are not maybe even highlighted for some reason.
Yeah, part of the humor comes from Boimler thinking of himself as a loser and other characters maybe making fun of him. But we know that he can, if he just gets like 10 degrees more self-confidence, he will not be a loser anymore. He's great.
That's true. Yes. And, we see the journey. And then, the second thing that I was like, I want this from a show. Why is this a joke? Is I do kind of wonder if in the early episodes it is treated like a joke to say second contact. But second contact is extremely important. The follow-up is actually extremely important. And it literally felt like they were delivering that line as a joke. But then it actually was like, no, we realize that this is important. That it is not just the first time you interact with another civilization. It is the ongoing relationship building that really matters. So,
yeah, it is. I think it is difficult for any franchise that's still making content in 2024 to connect itself with a TV show that premiered in 1966. Just because of the nature of television at that time, like there was no serialization. Right. It was Monster of the Week, self-contained beginning, middle, and end storytelling. So the idea of establishing a continuity as far as like exploration or the canon of the Federation goes, like it wasn't a concern for those writers. And so we find ourselves trying to like redress and reference and maybe course correct an industry that's had a dozen seismic shifts since then. And I think Star Trek is fortunate because, 20 years after the show premiered, they were, making movies that did a little bit of that work too. But it's still, for me as a fan, it's interesting to see them, going back to a lot of those ideas and themes and like molding them into a way to make it like compatible with streaming in the 2020s.
Yeah. And the format, it's a long enough series to give you something to work with. It's you have 4 main characters that you follow really closely, which, I prefer that to what we were getting with Discovery, where it was like, this is the person, which just felt like it was at odds with the whole premise.
Yeah.
But in addition to the 4 main characters, there is a really cool supporting cast that gets built out over time. And the 4 characters are really compelling. With Rutherford, the engineer, they really nailed the engineer personality type. There were so many moments where there'd just be a Rutherford moment, and I would just sit there staring at my engineer spouse, and he'd be like, "Yep, I know." Like the episode where they spend the entire vacation fixing doors by choice, and that's their idea of a good time.
Yeah.
I'm like, yeah. I think it's because there are so many engineers who watch Star Trek. Star Trek understands the importance of accurately portraying engineers.
Yeah,
because it's like, Miles O'Brien is really accurate. Rutherford is really accurate. Like they're like, yeah, that's you guys.
Even though Scotty, his behavior might not have been very engineer-like. He referred to the Enterprise's engines as his bairns, like he considered them his children. Like he was so intimate and caring for the ship, and that is a theme that continues up until the end of the series.
Yeah, totally. So if you guys are looking for, and the humor works, and it is not as infantile, and I would say, if you don't like the first several episodes, keep going. If you don't like the show by the time we get to the second half of season 1, then maybe it won't be for you. And I wouldn't tell you to invest further time, but it did take me a while to really get past. And I felt like there's a certain negativity and cynicism and manic pace that I associate with cheap, shitty adults. Ooh, we had a swear word animation that I sort of felt in the early episodes that goes away. It goes away.
Yeah.
And the show just becomes something that, like, this is one of my favorite Star Trek series now, for sure.
For sure. And, a lot of Star Trek comedy in the past has been bad. Like when original series or Deep Space Nine or Next Generation tried to be funny, it's pretty cringy. It's, especially like a lot of the relationship comedy.
Yeah.
And so that was one of the reasons why I was hesitant to jump into this series, but it really does nail the comedy. It's legit very funny. You know, Mike McMahon talked about how like people tell him, and I would tell him this too, like how much this show defied their expectations.
Yes.
And I think that is a difficult thing to do in any deep fan community, right? Like, I think most Star Trek fans saw the trailers for Lower Decks and were like, this is not for me. But universally, the people who watched fell in love with it. Mm-hmm. And I think having a show, you know, that was able to convince new fans and old fans to change their mind about something, I think is incredibly valuable. And it's also indicative of the kind of fans Star Trek fans can be, that they're willing to let themselves be wrong and enjoy a thing. And I think that that's part of Lower Decks' legacy, you know?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Is there anything else we want to say to pitch listeners before we go into a spoiler-laden discussion of the final season?
I think we've given them the hard sell.
Yeah, cool. So guys, give it a watch. Come on back when you're done.
Hell
and
yes.
now we'll be talking about the last season. You know, one of the things I get really excited about with Star Trek is whenever we get a new insight into a different society or civilization, and getting the Orion world fleshed out in this series has really been a highlight for me. And we open this season with some more of that.
Yeah, you know, the Orions, you know, were the first aliens in Star Trek, right? They were, you see the Orion slave girl in the pilot episode with Christopher Pike. So I think it's great that one of the most like stereotypical, like problematic elements of the show from the 60s has been adapted and is now, you know, we have Tendi, who's like the mistress of the Winter Constellation, like this incredibly competent, resourceful, and compassionate pirate queen who left her, you know, throne basically to join Starfleet because she was inspired to be a scientist and to explore. And like her family relationships, the relationships with like the ruling class of Orion, the relationships with the Orions, like it's all so like well built and in depth. And I think that just speaks to one of the strengths of Lower Decks as a whole, is that it is able to give time and development, even in these like 22 to 25 minute chunks, in a way that most like hour-long shows are just not capable of. And I think that's remarkable.
Yeah, having so much of the Orion culture fleshed out in that Deep Space Nine crossover episode was I think a key part for making me see like that this show cared about things that I care about. I was surprised at the end of the season before this one with having Devana Tendi still out on Orion. They spent more episodes with her on Orion than I was expecting there to be. But I guess it makes sense because that's the only place we were ever going to see that expanded on.
Yeah.
And we did get her to come back. What do you think about her and her sister and that whole relationship?
Yeah, I think one of the interesting things about this episode was that, you know, because of their lack of communication, you know, Tendi was so concerned about her sister being pregnant, and that she assumed that she was going to be weaker and that she was keeping it a secret, but it was actually, she had been honest with everybody else and told everybody else in her crew that she was pregnant, and it wasn't an issue, but Tendi just assumed it was. And I think you see this with a lot of the other characters, where if they would just say what's on their mind, it would avoid a lot of tension and conflict.
I should talk to some of my friends who've been pregnant, because I bet a lot of them would have a lot of feelings about this experience of being kind of infantilized by somebody because you're pregnant without that being what you're looking for,
Yeah, exactly. And I think Tendi is someone who has to solve a problem. And so sometimes she creates problems where there isn't one, and that, includes in her own family. Sometimes when a family member, I think, with anybody, when your family member is going through something, you're so close to them that you can't really see the whole picture. And, Tendi can only see what's right in front of her.
What do you think about the way they decided to sort of flesh out the Orion species as yep, these guys are pirates and they have a pirate society?
Star Trek is very much given to a unilateral planet where
people with hats.
Everybody everybody has either a fedora, and then the next week they're at a planet with Roman centurion hats. And so I guess the Orions work in that paradigm. You're kind of left wondering, and this even includes the Klingons, how did you develop warp technology? If everybody's a warrior, everybody's a pirate. But I think if you don't think about it too much, it can be pretty fun. And I guess you could just chalk it up to, they just steal warp engines and reverse engineer it or whatever.
Although one of the things that I loved about this series was we got to see a Klingon farm.
Yes.
And I think that episode is the opening animation for that episode, where it's just the dawn on the Klingon farm. It's just truly some of the best animation on the whole series. It's really calling to mind Works Progress Administration, propaganda about growing things in America, and all other kinds. I mean, there's some of the Soviet propaganda for farming as well. There's some real artistry in how they're depicting that. And we do see life on a Klingon farm. And I love that.
Yeah, and I think that's episode 4, Farewell to Farms. It's such an interesting flip on the traditional mode of Klingon masculinity that we've seen, because most of the scenes of Klingons that we've watched in Star Trek have been in space, where all their warriors go, and so we've seen a pretty unilateral perspective on what a Klingon is supposed to be. But if you go back to Kronos and talk to a farmer, he's like, no, a real man stays at home and grows food. So then other warriors can go off and conquer whatever. It's because of me that there is a Klingon empire. And I think that's a really great insight into this society. And I love the relationship between the two brothers, clearly very loving, but also extremely competitive. And anytime they're in the same room with each other, they're just over the other one, but you can tell that there's actual love there.
I love those two characters so much.
Yeah.
And it's sort of the introduction to his farmer brother is so, you think he's just going to be a clod, and he's not. There's so much more going on. I really liked the Klingon captain character, even from the last season where we dealt with him, because I like any kind of Klingons where you get to see some of the complexity is compelling to me.
Malor, the Klingon farmer, using the idea of, instead of stopping a river, you build a dam to sort of fix the multiversal fissure, that you needed an outside perspective to solve your science problem, and it came from a farmer. I think that's wonderful. It just shows how much Star Trek values different perspectives, and how it incorporates all kinds of diversity,
Totally. Yeah, and validates why he's there. And I do hope he gets to go back to his farm. I think he doesn't want to be out there with his brother doing stuff, but he's just trying to be a good brother. But
his favorite thing to do with the spaceship is attach animal tusks to its hull.
That would be one of my interests as well. But yes. And put up his feet, and I don't know. Wow, there's such a great character dynamic. I would really love to see more from them. Wonderful Klingon guys.
I don't know if this was intentional or not, but to me, in that episode 4, Farewell to Farms, where the captain back at home and he's rejected being part of the Klingon fleet because he views it as like imbued with dishonor. I think it's talking about depression, because he's sort of refusing to take joy in anything that he used to enjoy, right, or used to participate in. And it takes his brother and his friends to sort of like drag him back to this thing that they know he loves. And all the while he's kicking and screaming to not participate in this thing that used to give him purpose. And, you know, finally, after a lot of work, a lot of pain sticks, he's able to sort of like come into his own again. And what does that call? Well, you can't take pleasure in something.
Anhedonia?
Yes. Yeah. So he has this sort of, he's like existing with anhedonia, and he can't even appreciate the presence of Mariner when she arrives, or the presence of his brother. And I think through this episode, he's able to find himself again.
Oh, that's a really great take. I mean, I think that's real. I kind of viewed it through a political lens of it being like, he's like, I don't want to be part of this current system that is doing things badly and is corrupt. And if I have to, you know, be part of a corrupt Klingon empire, I would rather be a farmer. But I think you're right. It is a metaphor, for depression, for sure.
I also saw it as a way for us to get another example of heavy metal in space. We got a Klingon thrash lute band. Oh
my God, they were so great with the harmonium. What's the accordion that's like a concertina? There's like a concertina and the headbanging. The music was like actually good. Mm-hmm. I would have liked to have heard that song more.
God, the music in this series is overall like amazing. Honestly, like in the last episode, there's a couple great homages to the Wrath of Khan score. Music by Chris Westlake, and this is my favorite theme since Next Generation, which is, you know, composed by Jerry Goldsmith. No small potatoes in that department. So, so it's a series that really pays attention to every aspect of production, and when you have great music, it really does elevate everything.
Yeah, I think that's true. And the voice actor performances are amazing.
Yeah, and you know, they really tapped into a lot of the like alternative comedy scene out of New York and Los Angeles. Like there's like Tawny Newsome is part of that, and then you have Paula Tompkins and Paul Scheer, you know, who were like paragons of that world. But you also have traditional voice actors doing supporting roles like Phil Lamar, Nolan North, Fred Tatasciore, and Eugene Cordero. So yeah, at every point in the voice acting casting, it's just like nailing it out of the park. And I think Jack Quaid as Boimler is so sweet and adorable that it like you need somebody who can be annoying and endearing at the same time, and he really pulls it off.
Yeah, it's true. That's a very hard needle to thread.
Oh, I also want to shout out to Gillian Vigman as Dr. Tiana, who's one of the funniest supporting characters in Star Trek history. And I think it's an example of the show using profanity brilliantly, because we don't hear it. It's always bleeped out. But I think the jokes are paced knowing that the punchline is going to be a bleep. So the bleep functions as part of the punchline, and that's what makes it funny.
It's paced well, yeah.
Yeah, and I think because Gillian Vigman's like is so exuberant and gruff in her profanity, that the contrast of going from to beep is part of the joke.
Yeah. Well, you know, it's funny. When I first saw her, I was like, why is there an alien that's literally just an anthropomorphic cat? And I didn't realize that dated back to the original animated series.
Yeah.
And I think it's great. Like, if you're going to have animation, then do the kind of aliens that you really can't do, you know, with people. Like, even though it is truly silly to just be like, yep, these are cats.
Yes.
That's just a cat. It's a cat.
Yeah, there's an alien with 3 arms in the animated series, which is something that like you couldn't do practically, like 3 functional arms, especially in the 60s. But yeah, even back in the 70s, they took that philosophy to heart.
Yeah. There were so many, there's a lot of nods to stuff from the original series that I did not get because I'm not a TOS person. And I would say that like, I appreciate that I didn't need them to enjoy the show, but it also is funny to be like, oh, it's those fucking weird Zeus aliens.
Yeah. Whereas I'm like,
a giant green hand.
Yeah. Who mourns for Adonais? Yes. Classic episode where Apollo is a toxic misogynist. Nice one.
Yeah.
And I think that is something that Lower Decks did struggle with, is how obvious to make the references, because sometimes they'll have a reference that is a joke, but then another character will like point out that it's a reference, and they'll like have somebody play a flute that's clearly like an acknowledgement to a very famous episode of Next Generation, and then somebody else will say, "Oh, what do you think you are, Picard?" And it's like, "Oh, that's too much," and it's kind of cringy. But I think as the show went on, it did find a way to not, put a hat on these jokes, and I think the show became all the better for it.
Yeah, and it's subtle enough. I mean, I don't know. It didn't bother me. I mean, I was just watching an episode where we literally have Mariner play a flute and talk about how she's trying to model her life on that episode of Picard. But the thing is, like, the way they talk about and reference these people from history, it doesn't feel unrealistic, because we also talk about and reference real and fake people, characters, and stories from the past in our lives as well.
Yeah. I was sort of wondering, like, would these people know who Ensign Kim was? But then I'm like, no. I know how Colonel Joshua Chamberlain displayed valiant conduct on the second day of the Battle of Gettysburg. Right. So like, and that's partially because he's from Maine, and I spent a couple years in Maine, so he's like as famous as a president there, and also because I live like 20 miles from the Battle of Gettysburg now.
I assume that was the reason.
Yeah. So, but I think if I was in Starfleet, I would probably be real interested in the 7 years Voyager spent lost in the Delta Quadrant, Like I would read about those events with great interest, just like you could read about like the whale ship Essex and how its crew of whalers, were shipwrecked and cannibalized each other in order to survive, and how that inspired Moby Dick. And, like, yes, you have this intimate knowledge of these sailors from the 19th century. So, yeah, I think that's totally logical, especially for these self-described Starfleet nerds.
Yeah, exactly. Like, these are nerds. They're familiar with history, and that's also the audience that they're performing it from. So to us, it makes sense that they would be like that. Yeah. I'm going to talk about our Vulcan friend, our new cast member.
Tillin, voiced by Gabriel Ruiz.
Yes. I thought it was when they added her last season. It was last season, right? I thought they set it up really well, and I thought it was cool to have get another different kind of cultural perspective, even if it is one of the the Vulcans are more fleshed out than the majority of other cultures.
Yeah, and it was really easy to sort of fall in love with Tallinn because she's so funny, and not just from the show perspective of the way that writing a one-liner for a Vulcan can be very funny, but she makes these like dry witticisms that are clearly the character telling a joke. And even when you get used to Tallinn, hearing a Vulcan tell a joke is still surprising, and that's used sort of just enough to make it effective. And the way her friendship and intimacy grows between like the four main characters, I think is really well done. Is especially when Mariner, Tendi, and her go off on an undercover mission.
Yes.
And like a bond over, being, on an away mission, being scientists and sort of overcoming the sense of competition. Like, it's very sweet and also very believable. Just Tendi and Taylin screaming science besties as they solve science problems.
Yeah, it's I thought maybe they were introducing her to try to create a pressure for Tendi and Rutherford to like act on their obvious mutual attraction.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm glad that it didn't operate to just do that. That would have felt cheap.
Yeah. And it is interesting how these characters have had a little bit of romance with characters who are introduced and leave, but that doesn't create any tension, between our four main group. Like sometimes there's a little hint of it, but not really.
Yeah, but I really, really like, you do get the sense, especially with the end of the finale, that there's an opportunity for Rutherford and Tendi to become a couple in the future.
Yeah.
But at no point is it implying that Mariner and Boimler are going to be a couple, because unlike lots of media, this show is recognizes the possibility of men and women being friends. Amazing.
What
like
an idea.
Shouldn't be rare, and yet it is. And a show.
Yeah.
And I'm like, I feel like if they were getting sort of shuffled into that, I would resent it for sure.
Yeah. It seems so natural for Tendi and Rutherford to have gotten together at some point, but I just love watching them as besties so much that I don't care. Like, yeah, just be platonic forever and ever if you want. That's fine with me. Let them like repair their own little shuttlecraft project in the hangar bay until the end of time, please.
Well, that's the thing though, is like I'm 100% fine with there not being any relationships of the romantic nature developed between the cast. But
yeah.
There is you can tell that they both have feelings for each other. And so I like how the show handled it with that feeling, making it like it's still like, it's ambiguous whether there will be something in the future, but there's a possibility for it. And it's rooted in their friendship and not in like weird gender bullshit.
Yeah.
But I do think that like, if you were to say in the future, they never even tried being a couple, I would be like, oh, that is a little sad, because it feels like that's something which they do want. Mm-hmm. But let's talk more about Mariner in general. It's really awesome to have Mariner be bi and not have that be exoticized or treated as surprising or unusual. But I also just want to say that Mariner gets a really full character development story arc through this series that, I'm sure this is true in Discovery, but like that generally speaking is not given for Black women. And we really get to see the story of her and her relationship with her mother on the center stage and her character growth. And that's a really big deal too.
Yeah. And maybe it's just the way that Discovery has been fundamentally different in its development from Lower Decks, but it seems like you can track Mariner's development and growth and maturity and her relationship with her mother through the seasons in a fairly consistent and logical level, while as Discovery felt just so all over the place. And so I'm just another reason to be appreciative of the way Michael McMahon and the writers have stewarded these characters. Like, you can tell that they really paid attention to how these characters are developing, not just personally, but interpersonally.
Like, I think that a lot of the character growth for her kind of came through in the earlier seasons, and there was less distance to travel here, and I'm fine with that. And, I appreciated her whole, like, I kind of forgot to break up with my girlfriend saga.
Yeah. I think in a lot of the relationships I observe from my peers and younger, that is sort of how they operate with even long-term relationships, where they'll just like stop talking to somebody. Like instead of confronting the difficult conversation of the breakup, they'll just like, ghost someone. And I think that Mariner isn't cruel, certainly. She just wanted to avoid an awkward conversation. And the more she was able to avoid it, the more convenient it was to pretend that they were broken up. And so I think that feels right for her, at least because she's somebody who was very eager to confront like physical danger, but emotional danger she ran away from. So like in the early seasons, you saw her like kind of keep the fact that her mom was the captain of the Cerritos a secret from everyone else on the crew. And like she didn't even want them to know that part of her life. She didn't want anybody to have an insight into her emotional core that she couldn't control. And even though she's matured quite a bit since then, I think that still feels sort of in line with the character's behavior.
I think it's great. Yeah. And she still gets to do all of her shenanigans and shit. And like, I also like that the series let her explore potential other options before coming back. I mean, if there's something that I think Star Trek, like it makes sense that in Star Trek, they're convinced that working in Star Trek is the best thing that somebody could ever possibly be. And I'm not someone who's sold on that, actually. And I'm glad that they gave her character a chance to explore other options as well. Because it just seems like she doesn't want to be there so much of the time. So like make it clear to me then why she does decide to do it after all.
Yeah, as much as Next Generation really dropped the ball with the writing of Wesley Crusher, I think one of its great insights was realizing, like Starfleet's not for Wesley. He should be going off doing his mystical traveler journey. And I think with the series going forward, we did get hints of that with a lot of other characters, like Jake Sisko. And I think it was great to see Mariner be able to explore that part of herself and then realize how at home she did feel on the Cerritos. And part of that, I'm sure, was because of these really intimate friendships she had formed with her crewmates.
Yeah, that's true. I feel like if she didn't have those friendships that were central, she might have decided to continue to being Indiana Jones or Dr. Aphra, but not evil, for example. Let's talk about Shax and how great Shax is. I love the Bajorans. Bajorans are my favorite. I think that, because of my entry point to the show was the DS9 crossover, I could have had a bit of a sense of his personality in from there. A lot of people responded strongly to the episode of this series, this season, where he's literally having a fight with himself in his mind. Do you have thoughts about that one?
Yeah. I think with a lot of the ways Star Trek portrays characters who are skilled at violence, I think it's wise enough to know that a lot of that violence comes from years of trauma, and that certainly includes Kira, and that also even in this comedic cartoon with this big burly bear man, he has to meditate pretty frequently to keep those demons at bay. And sometimes that violence comes out, and sometimes it's played for laughs, like his burning desire to detonate the warp core. But to get that insight into him, that he's constantly at war with himself, that he's constantly keeping his PTSD from rearing its head, I think is a powerful statement. Even if it's played sort of like for fun and for laughs, I think it was great of the show to give him that time.
Well, I also like how his guilt is telling him, like, you murdered all these people. He's like, yeah, but they were fucking fascists. I'm like, thank you. Yeah. I appreciate the reminders in this series that, like, that is what was happening. I also think it's smart for Star Trek to recognize that. It makes sense for some of their more battle-hardened characters to be that way because they actually had to be freedom fighters. Like, that was that was the life that they had to have. And it does make you wonder, well, if somebody's like from Earth, why would they be like that? like why would you want to do that? Actually, that's kind of, but if you like literally are like, yeah, we were being oppressed by fascist colonizers, so this is what I've learned to do. It feels very different as a character choice.
Yeah, and that is like an interesting, problem that I think Star Trek has had is, like drama is based on conflict, right? So if these humans are from this utopian planet Earth, why are they going off into space to go to war and stuff? And I think you see that in Strange New Worlds with Dr. M'Benga. Like how does he have kung fu skills where he's able to like defeat 10 Klingon warriors? But I think, I think that's the advantage of like an animated show. You can just draw any number of alien characters, and so there's no, makeup budget that you need to worry about. So you can have this Bajoran warrior go into a dream sequence where he fights every Cardassian that he's ever killed. And even if your cause is righteous, that much murder could do a whammy on your conscience.
Yeah, definitely.
Honestly, I like how they developed a lot of the senior officers, but Freeman, as her lower decks personnel has matured, she's been more willing to trust them, and giving them a leash to do things their way. And in the episode Upper Decks, we get to see her like daily itinerary, and she spends time going to play recitals and musical performances. We saw Picard do that in Next Generation quite a bit, and I think that this episode sort of gives reason for that she's forging these emotional bonds with her young ensigns and lieutenants so that they trust her. And I think that shows really great leadership. In the beginning of the series, she was pretty distant and maybe incompetent and maybe untrustworthy herself, but as the series has gone on, she's been able to forge these bonds with everyone from her first officer to the newest ensign. And I think that's great. And,
yeah. And you really see how essential those relationships managing and her leadership are like that. And there's more than one episode that really go there now.
Yeah. And speaking of her first officer, I'm a big fan of Ransom. He's extraordinarily genuine, right? He's a jock. He loves working out. He'll talk about his body all the time, but he does have an inherent moral core where he's trying to do the right thing. He's trying to be a leader. And if the way to get there is to do some crunches and get in a fight while shirtless, then he'll take that route for sure. But it's also nice knowing you have this like Superman at your back, willing to like punch some aliens in the face to save your life.
Yeah, I mean, when he's first introduced, he's exhausting, and he's he's an antagonist for Mariner, basically, right? And I like how they develop, and the episode where he's pretending that he's knocked out to make everybody work together, I was like, he's definitely pretending that he's knocked out, and he was. Yeah. Hooray! It's like, yes, that great technique to make people stop fighting, pretending that you're unconscious.
Yeah, I don't know if I buy that as a leadership style as much as I buy Freeman's "I'm going to trust you because I believe in you" style. I think that's probably more effective than going to sleep. But I think Ransom's heart's in the right place.
Yeah, yeah.
We should talk about Starbase 80.
Yeah, Starbase 80. So was that a thing before this series?
It had shown up in novels, I think, but nothing in any televised Trek. But just this idea of the worst station in the Federation and reasons why people want to avoid it. But I think this episode says something really smart about institutional neglect, right? That the more you ignore a problem, the worse it gets, and the harder it is for the people who are there on site to do their jobs.
Yeah.
And you need someone to go there and fix that problem. And that's, part of the Starfleet ethos where, you take care of each other. And I think because Starbase 80 became sort of the stinky problem, people wanted to avoid it. And there's no way a problem gets solved by avoiding it.
It bothered me at first that there would be such an unequal distribution of resources between government facilities in this utopian future, because it's like, that's terrible, actually. That's completely inexcusable. But they use it in really great storytelling ways, because I'm glad that they sort of focused on it and confronted it, because you can't just let that stand. That reminded me of, we have in New York, we've got like something called participatory budgeting, where you vote. And anybody can do this. You could be a kid, or you can be, a non-citizen. Anybody can do participatory budgeting, and you vote for which projects you want discretionary spending for your city council district to go to. And when I lived in Williamsburg, and this began, Williamsburg was already very, like, a vastly, rapidly gentrifying neighborhood. And the kind of discretionary budget things I would see to be voted on would be like, we want to put in a new gate for the community garden on North 5th Street. And you'd be like, yeah, that's a good idea. And then I moved to Sunset Park, which because the Newark, of course, is also gentrifying, but is a more low-income neighborhood. And the participatory budgeting items were, we don't have bathrooms that are small enough for the kindergarteners, so we need to get the bathroom replaced. Or there's no air conditioning in the gym. And you're just like, how the fuck are these? These are like not just the same school system. This is the same borough within the same city and the same school system. And you're saying that in Williamsburg, the kindergartners have got a place to pee, and in Sunset Park, they don't. Like, what the fuck? And the first time I saw that participatory budget about, I just literally teared up because it was so upsetting to me. And I'm like, how is this allowed? Now, obviously, our real world is quite the opposite of the Star Trek utopia. But like, just the level of disconnect between like what is considered an acceptable standard of function in one place and another, while they're supposed to have more equal distribution of resources. Like, it's one thing to not give the Cerritos the most high-tech laser weapon or whatever the fuck, because they're not supposed to be doing war or whatever. But it's another thing to not have the basic systems maintained.
Yeah, like the Starbase 80's gravity is fucked up. Like its electrical grid is messed up. It has giant bats living in certain sections of the ship, and that's funny. But it does speak to how rot can enter any system. And I think if we're doing work for that phenomenon, we are operating on such vast distances in Star Trek where it could take weeks to get from point A to point B. And if Starbase 80 is in such a geographical backwater, sometimes those problems can just get swept under the rug. And maybe it takes a ship like the Cerritos with the power of friendship to get those problems fixed. But I also like that once you get a couple competent people there, the problem gets fixed. Yeah. Like, it's not insurmountable. It may be a pain in the ass for a day or two, but it can be done.
Well, I love the episode where she's convinced that it's cursed because she had a traumatic experience there. And the people who were like working on her are like, no, it's just misfunctional. And I hadn't realized until I did this rewatch about how the captain, like, her alternate reality was like cursed to be stuck on that station. And we end this season with her willingly choosing to go manage it because there's such potential there.
Yeah. And that's another great full circle moment for the series, not only just for the captain, but for the station itself, because it is an older facility. It's not as affected by these timey-wimey waves as much as newer technology would be. So it actually comes in handy that Starbase 80 is still around in the state that it is. And I like that about the series, that there's a place for everyone.
That's a nice way to put it. I also really didn't notice until the very end of the series how much dimensional rifts were just like the theme of the season. Do you have any thoughts about that as the theme of the season?
Yes. there's been so many bad multiverse stories throughout Marvel, but throughout Star Trek. Like there's the very famous Mirror Mirror episode of the original series, which is great, but because it's one episode, we don't really have to think about how it doesn't make any sense at all, and that's part of why it wasn't in Next Generation. And then I don't like any of the episodes in Deep Space Nine where they use the mirror universe, and I really don't like. They all got great outfits, absolutely.
Yes.
And I really don't like the way Discovery used the mirror universe at all. It
was insane to go right into a mirror universe the second you fucking begin your series. Like what?
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Okay, continue.
I can get a whole other, much more negative conversation if we go down that road. But so I think when we have like Boimler's frustration that all these other universes are cheap remixes of universes that we've already seen, I think that does speak to a lot of what we see in comics, a lot of what you see in, a lot of franchises, that they're just adding these multiverse elements, for like cheap fanboy, breadcrumbs where there's really no there. And I really like the way, especially in the last episode, it gave us sort of this conclusion as to like why it was happening, how to fix it, how to actually utilize it. And when we have the cameo-filled penultimate episode, I really loved the idea that the people who are exploring these multiverses are exploring the human experience, or the sentient being experience, whereas, our Federation is exploring space. They're exploring the bonds between people, and how no matter what reality, Boimler and Marin are in, they're still best friends. Tendi and Rutherford are best friends in every multiverse or every universe. And I don't think I've ever seen a multiverse story use it to sort of like harmonize with its own themes so beautifully.
Yeah, I really liked how, I forgot the character's name, but how she resituated the exploration that way.
Yeah, Alfre Woodard from First Contact. Yeah.
Oh my God. What an actor, right?
Hell yeah.
She's tremendous. And yeah, so I thought that was really interesting. And as much as I also laughed at the same call outs that Boimler did, I'm excited about the armies of Ensign Kim's, and of course them immediately addressing the thing that we've been yelling about the whole time, which is like, why hasn't he been promoted? What the fuck? It's crazy.
Yeah, getting Garrett to do that, to hear him chanting Kim, it was really great, because I think there's a lot of fan support for him and that character, and how, like, I really love Voyager, but there's a lot of bad stereotypes that Kim was subjected to throughout that series, and him not getting a position of leadership is one of those. And so in a lot of ways, that episode really does redress some of the mistakes of Star Trek past. And I think there's another one in that episode addresses that I'm sure is closer to your heart specifically.
Indeed. So one of the things that Sarah Daniel Rasher and I both love about a good Mirror Universe episode is that everything gets to be a little gayer. And of course, that's like, wow, I guess being queer is evil. But yes, that's apparently how you get queerness in through the censors. I was excited to see that we have canonical recognition of Garak and Bashir as a couple. And of course, it's an alternate reality couple. But it's not an evil mirror universe. But this is what's interesting. It's not an evil mirror universe couple. It's a non-evil mirror universe couple, which I suppose is progress. And rather than just having Kira be gay for herself, which, like, I get it. We can have them be a couple, and, yes, one of them is a hologram, but he's a hologram who's a guy, and neither of them are evil.
Yeah, and even
if anything, this is a less evil Garrick. Garrick is like a surgeon. He's not a tailor. What?
I even love that this version of this Curzon Dax is like kind of rolls his eyes at them and says they like to brag about how statistically unlikely their marriage is. So the fact that so I guess one alternate universe version came into contact with this ship, and these two characters immediately fell in love, and I think that speaks to how true their connection is, right? Like they're arguing over which universe they should spend the rest of their lives in, and they eventually say, "I really don't care where we end up as long as we're together." And I think that's so sweet. Like they are like a couple who's been married for 20 years. You know, they're arguing, they're bickering, but at the end they kiss and make up.
But the other thing is we know that Cardassians argue to flirt. So the whole time I'm like, Bashir, do you not understand? This is just his way of showing affection. But yeah, I was really glad to see that happen. And I was not expecting. And that we even got another flash of them together in the finale episode because they're just like, they understand the fans like need this. They understand the years of damage and healing that have now been done for having official recognition. And perhaps someday we'll get to have it between the canon universe, but at least it's not an evil mirror universe. It's a just different universe.
Yeah. If we got a Star Trek Picard, we could have an episode of some series in the future where Garrick and Bashir are like renewing their vows on Risa or something. Why not? And I think that this could be the first step towards something in that direction.
It's progress to have that. I mean, and this show like has Mariner as bi, and that's just treated as very normal, which it is. Her being bi had nothing to do with her breakup with her girlfriend. And even in the episode where she's trying to have her own Picard in 25 years in a minute experience, she's like, I haven't met a husband or wife yet. And nobody's like, it's been really cool to have it done that way. And there's been such nice natural, like you see people using adaptive mobility devices. You see people wearing different kinds of headscarves and turbans just among the humans of on the ship. Somebody's got Geordi LaForge's visor type accessibility device, and just seeing that be included throughout the show and just like the life of the show.
Yeah, I think that is one of the great insights that Next Generation had, and that I'm glad Star Trek is, and I'm glad we see Lower Decks keeping that tradition.
Although one thing that I feel like was left dangling that is a little bit disappointing because I feel like I want to understand it more and better is the whole thing with Rutherford's implant. Like, what is happening with it? Why is it not connecting with the ship? What does it stand? Like, it's obviously symbolic, and I don't know. I mean, do you have thoughts to share about it?
Yeah, I thought it was interesting that, when he encountered Otherford, which is a pun I celebrate and take joy in, that Rutherford sort of let his implant take over his entire personality or his entire body. And I think that Rutherford was so obsessed with improving himself that he lost touch with who he is. Whereas this Rutherford is able to realize that his connection to the Cerritos and to its crew is more important than any way he can improve himself with this artificial augment. And I do think it was a little rushed, and I do wish it could have been more fully developed, but I still like the place that he landed in.
Yeah. But it just was sort of like, okay, now you have two eyes. Like, what does that mean?
Yeah.
Especially because it's all tied to his mysterious shadowy past.
Yeah.
As well as his, mental regulation. It's threads that could be picked up in the future, certainly. But
for sure.
I kind of wanted to get more of that and understand it better. Thoughts about cetacean ops?
I'm in love with it.
Yeah.
I love with the very idea. I love that in the last episode, Boimler has to go to fix it, and he's just shown like spraying one of the whales with a hose to keep it wet, so it can operate. But yeah, it's a sign of how inclusive the Federation truly is. Like, you don't need to be a bipedal carbon-based life form to be part of the Federation. You can be a hologram, you can be a non-corporeal being, you can be a whale, and you can speak in clicks and still be, a valued member of the crew. And I think that's beautiful. And, one of my favorite Star Trek movies is about an alien space probe coming to Earth to talk to whales, because, of course, they're the most intelligent life form, or the most interesting life form on Earth.
And they're all wearing those salmon hats now, so they've got fashion statements.
Hell yeah!
Seriously, guys, go look it up. I like how the way their camaraderie with the humans is depicted, and like their uniqueness, and that they're cute, but they're also kind of gross. And it does make you feel like, shouldn't all the ships have cetacean ops? Like, why? It feels like something that's a good idea. I must say, I am a little bit obsessed with the obnoxiousness of the orbs and cubes, and the I felt like that was one of the funniest episodes in terms of just straight up just jokes. The voiceover that was like, I wonder what they'll become. Oh God, it's just a bigger orb and a bigger cube. They aren't creative at all. Amazing moments.
It's a real fun riff on Let That Be Your Last Battlefield, where you have these two sides that have decided on this very arbitrary difference as a way to hate the other one, but making it comedic. And I think it's clear when, one of the princes or whatever of the orbs or the cubes disappear, that's going to end up sort of like a star-crossed lover, Romeo and Juliet kind of thing. But it's kind of cute that they immediately have an offspring, and they all find it adorable.
And it's shaped like a dreidel, which I think is important to note. He rotates like a dreidel, and he's dreidel-shaped. Square on is a dreidel. And then he shits on the ground. It's just also very funny to me. Yeah. What do we think of Boimler's journey with the pad? I kept expecting it to backfire in like a more serious way than it did, and I'm fine with the fact that it didn't.
Yeah, I think if all of us were given insight into another version of us's choices, right? Like, what would that how that person ask that cute person at the bar out for a date, or how would they have answered that question at the job interview? If we were given those answers, even if those weren't what we would choose, the fact that we know what that other version of us did, I think that would give us insight into maybe what we should do. And for Boimler to like divorce himself from that crutch by just breaking the pad, I think was a great moment for him.
I also think that he was essentially given it by the other Boimler.
Yeah.
Like, it's so over the top how he's handed off.
Yeah.
Boimler's
an over-the-top character.
That's true. It's like a gift he was given, you know what I mean?
Yeah. And, and I think his beard is an interesting, like, symbol of his journey with the pad, because it's pretty gross for several episodes, and it's ridiculous. And, he looks like a 15-year-old trying to grow facial hair. But by the end of the season, he's got like a William Riker kind of vibe going, and it's cool.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's much more convincing.
Yeah.
A sign of some maturity and confidence as well for him. Let's take some of the questions. One new species that is like almost too ridiculous for me to actually want to see resuscitated ever again, but I did get some fun moments from those bird people, the Cloacans, and I have Dr. Miglimac is so obnoxious. He makes me, but like I enjoy the character's existence, but like I would fucking throttle him if I had to deal with him in real life.
Yeah, I think he's a good supporting character. I don't need more of him.
Yeah, more of him would be very bad. But the episode where the food critics, who are like the gods of his planet, keep saying they can't like everything tastes bad, and it's because they can't taste anything anymore. The entire time I'm just thinking of, are you familiar with the Yankee Candle Index?
No.
So earlier in the ongoing pandemic, somebody observed that in areas where there was about to be where there was a really bad COVID outbreak, you would see the reviews of Yankee Candle Shop, which is like a mall store that makes scented candles. Mm-hmm. The reviews would start to be like, I couldn't smell any of these candles. They smelled terrible. And you would literally correlate with the level of COVID in the community, because all these people would be running around with COVID, having no sense of smell and not putting two and two together. That the reason they can't smell anything is because they're sick, because there is something wrong with them. And you would also see it in reviews of restaurants on Yelp. There would be cycles of everybody suddenly saying that everything is tasteless. And it's like, yeah, you have COVID. Your taste buds are fucked up. Some people can take like 6 months to recover that. Some people never recover that. Mm-hmm. But the timing of that as being like, we've lost our ability to taste, and rather than looking inward to determine that there's something that was wrong with us that we might need to address, that we might need to heal, we are instead taking this out on everybody else and covering it up. That whole thing is a COVID story to me. And I know that might not be a COVID story to everyone else, but that's a COVID story to me. And I would say, actually, based on my understanding of the timeline of show construction, that it is possible that the initial turns out we can't taste anything joke is also a COVID joke to the people who made it.
Yeah, and even if it wasn't their intention, I'm sure, though, that was something floating around in the cultural atmosphere that they were absorbing.
Yeah.
Like, it's probably a joke that would not have happened if it wasn't for COVID.
Yeah. I mean, so I think of it as like the assumption that the inability to grapple with the limitation of your body, the fact that we are capable of being sick. We are capable of losing skills and abilities that we value and that are highly valued in our culture, and then feeling like you have to cover up for that because of that loss to your identity, the loss to your status. Those two bird jerks, they're like, they got long COVID, and I feel for them, and I'm hopefully they'll be able to get some useful medical care.
And it's interesting
make a difference for them.
Yeah, and it's interesting that Miggly Mo is a psychiatrist, and he calls himself a chef of the mind, and it's played as a joke, but like, no, that's what those two critics need. They need somebody to heal their minds so they can, accept the limitations of their bodies.
Yeah.
And I think that's, when Tendi is off on the mission with Mariner and Taylin, she is keeping hidden all her scientific accomplishments because she's so absorbed in this competition with Taylin that isn't really going on, and she feels so intimidated by Taylin's scientific prowess that she won't allow her own accomplishments to shine through. She's keeping those things, those accomplishments, like a secret to Mariner and Taylin themselves.
Well, I want to take some of the questions that we were sent in from our listeners. Slam Campbell asks, what character / plot / whatever from the show would you like to see brought up or carried on in some way into further Trek? Like how Barclay becoming integral to Voyager's return home, or the Dominion returning in Picard.
I was thinking about this in the episode that I just referenced. A way to get me excited for a Section 31 story is to have Taylin, Mariner, and Tendi infiltrate Section 31 as spies within the spy organization for some mission of their own. So to have the three of them maybe have their own little spinoff, I think would be great. If there's maybe a life after Lower Decks as a series, maybe we could just have like a Lower Decks movie with Captain Ransom and co-first officers Mariner and Boimler. I think that'd be great. Maybe just a romance show with Garrick and hologram Bashir. We could do that. Yeah, there's all sorts of wonderful like spin-offs or maybe single episodes that you could have with some of these Lower Decks characters.
Starbase 80, the series,
Yeah.
at that sort of interdimensional wormhole and keep it with the Admiral and like her whole thing, I think would be really interesting. Actually, what do you make of there being a young what's Guinan's people called?
Oh God.
Whatever. She's like, I'm a young whatever Guinan's people are. And she's like, that's just a person. Like, I don't.
Yeah, they're a part of the Federation. They've been kicking around for a few hundred years. Yeah, I think it's really cool to have another representative of their species on Starbase 80, and I think they have a really interesting sort of power set, I guess you could say. Like they have some psychic abilities. They have this preternatural knowledge to perceive disruptions in time. So that's why Q is scared of Guinan. Because she knows when he's changed reality in some way. She might not know specifically how, but she can sense that change. Or that when there's been time travel shenanigans going on in Next Generation, Guinan can sense that. And so to have someone from that species at this, fissure in the multiverse, I think is perfect. And you could have some really interesting dynamics with that character, advising the Freemans.
Yeah, I think that's really fun. And I would still like to see anything exploring more of the Orions and also Rutherford's past. Like there's some criminal enterprise thing happening. I just want to understand it.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm so sad this series ended when it did. It had at least another season in it.
Yeah, absolutely agree. Oh God, I want more episodes about the transition from a monetary-based system to a post-scarcity economy.
That was such a fun. I mean, I just so enjoyed like everything about we're turning our investment bank into an animal hospital, and now it smells better.
Yes, yeah, they're burning money. Yeah, it was.
There's litter boxes now. Yes, and that even in heaven, like there's some retrograde people who still like don't want to have the world be better because they are motivated by being a piece of shit.
And they resort to terrorism, but they're such pathetic terrorists that they can't even do it right.
Yeah, that felt like some useful, powerful social satire. I was glad they included that. Very pointed.
Because that is something that I've been struggling with my whole life as somebody who like grew up watching Star Trek and being like, well, isn't that like the destiny we want for the Earth? And here we are further away from that post-scarcity system than we've ever been in my entire lifetime, it seems like. And so for a show to directly address how much of a party that transition would be, at least when we finally get there, I was very gratified for that.
Yeah, how the vast majority of people want this, and it is a small group of people who do not, and nobody likes them, and they're stinky.
Yeah. I mean, we like libraries and healthcare. Mm-hmm. What's the problem?
The Museum of Shapes. Yeah. We want to go to the Museum of Shapes.
Hell yeah.
I really enjoyed that they actually did like an Apocalypse Now bit even this season. That was not something I expected.
They called him Admiral Melius. Well done.
I know. Exactly. I was like, this is for us. We had another listener question. Mezzantine says, with the whole series in hindsight now and this era of Trek production seemingly winding down, what do you think are the big contributions the show made to the franchise as a whole?
Wow. I think it brought a lot of humor into Star Trek. It's not like there wasn't humor before, but I think it showed how funny Star Trek could be if you got the right writers in place. I think it showed the importance of writers, like all great science fiction does. And I think this series was so much about the importance of friendship, and that's a legacy that's carried over, obviously, from like Kirk, Spock, and McCoy. but I think it so beautifully drew the relationships between these characters and how important it is for these, compassionate relationships are to exploring everything about ourselves, about the universe, and that, showing how essential that core compassion is to both Star Trek and to humanity. I think it is one of the most important contributions that Lower Decks has made, and I find that really wonderful.
Totally, yeah. Whenever Star Trek addresses alien societies and cultures that have been treated dismissively and tries to flesh them out in ways that make them richer, which this series has done multiple times, I think it brings something to our empathy for other people, and our ability to envision those who are different from us as also being valid and having their own lives and destinies. And I think that this series took that seriously in a way that really means a lot to me to see.
Yeah. This crew is excited by differences. It brings empathy, and I think that's a legacy that the motto of the Vulcan civilization is infinite diversity in infinite combinations, and so for a show to so wholeheartedly embrace that was wonderful to watch.
Yeah, for real. And it's sort of the kind of thing where, like, right now we're in a moment where, Disney, for example, is erasing a trans storyline in one of its kids shows, for example. And also Disney censored a trans storyline that was just in Moon Girl Never Dinosaur show. And they're just like writing people who are alive and whose lives are at risk out of stories. Which we know history will not look fondly upon this. Not only that, your literal children will be like looking at you the way they looked at fucking segregationists. Like, people who are alive now look at you like you're a fucking monster, because you are. I don't want to say representation, because I don't think that necessarily people would talk about things the same way in this utopian future. But it might have been in a space where they were able to make, in a show where they were able to make space to show Muslim and Sikh members of the crew and people with different kinds of disabilities. Like, it would have been cool to also have some trans rep in this in some way, which I know is also harder in the context of a comedy show, which is why you have trans people write that, because I don't trust otherwise.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree.
Well, I mean, just it does so much with subtext and was slower to the text. Got the honors of the most transparently subtextual depictions back when that was all you could do. So speaking of subtext and trans subtext specifically, which of course from Dax and Ezri and so many characters, Odo, it's there. We have yet another subtextually trans character in Lower Decks. One of our listeners, Halcyon, actually reminded me that there was a conversation that Jessie Earl, aka Jessie Gender, had kicked off online. She said her official headcanon now is that Tendi is transgender. It was revealed that she had a dead name. She doesn't have the same pheromones and as others, potentially cis Orion women. And she feels a bit ostracized from the assigned societal Orion roles. Just saying. And, the more you sort of think about that conversation, the more that really does make sense. In this case, rather than a given name, it's a dead name, it's a given title, that, i.e. Mistress of the Winster Constellations, which she has stepped away from. But, Devana being trans is the most reasonable explanation for why she doesn't have the pheromones. Like, there is no other reasonable explanation. So, thoughts on that?
Yeah, and I think it's so interesting that from what we see of Orion Society, it seems that these gender roles are very prescribed and rigid. And so for her to have to, go through changing them was probably pretty difficult, and one of the reasons why she wanted to go to Starfleet, not just because she loved science, but because it was probably a pretty radical transformation, socially, physically, and in every way, because there is this additional physical association with gender in Orion Society that human beings don't have.
Yeah.
Go ahead. Yeah.
And it's like human beings certainly like to pretend that we do. Like people just truly will believe the wildest things to maintain the illusion of like, this great significance and invaluable difference.
Mm-hmm.
Like the pheromones control, like whether this or that's like, no. Anyway.
And so I'm very glad that this headcanon exists. And I think there is a lot of there. And you know, Tendi is such a lovable, adorable character that I'm glad fans have this person to consider, you know, one of their own.
And Jesse actually interviewed the series creator Mike McMahon about it, and he's like, that wasn't my intent, but I totally get it, and I'm glad that people, find that to be something they connect with. And he's spoken in the interview a lot about the ways the show's tried to be thoughtful in terms of never punching down and helping people to really, see themselves. But, even with that, it would be great to have that be canonical. But yeah, I think to me, this is like a Dax situation where like there is no other explanation other than Daxes are trans. And there's no other explanation other than Tendi is trans, but it would be great for the show to make that clearer to the heteronormative society that like that's what's going on here. And have human characters who have, and also again, and to have human characters who have these experiences. Yeah. Which I know Discovery does. I know Discovery has that. I'm not out of the loop. Just saying.
One of the patterns of Star Trek is that the show can have various types of diversity in aliens first. Yeah. And then gradually those diversities are incorporated into our main human characters. And, that maybe that's a symptom of it being this, mega media franchise that represents various corporate interests. I do wish for more explicit representation, but the fact that people can, discover their own stories within these stories, like when I watch something like The Matrix now, there is something just so delicious knowing that it's a trans narrative, rather than the way I watched it when I was 15, that these themes have been able to grow with its audience.
Yeah. I spoke a bit about how gorgeous those opening scenes of the Klingon farm life were in terms of the animation, but I don't want to say that there's like no good, that's like the only good animation in the show or anything like that. Are there any visual moments that really stood out for you?
Well, one visual device that the show does really effectively is that they do visual aids to the technobabble. So when they're talking about different dimensions or the way the ships work, they will have a graphic on display that illustrates the point they're talking about, which is something that Star Trek has had some trouble with in the past. So that's one thing that it's done, especially this season when, these fissures have such a prominent role. But like a lot of the season finales in Lower Decks, the show just really pulled out all the stops for this last episode. Like it just looks incredibly gorgeous. The battle scenes and the interdimensional travel scenes are just filled with effects and beautiful animation. Like, spared no expense on this extra packed episode. So it's a real beautiful display of what you can do with TV animation.
And I'll say like a purely visual gag that has always worked for me is how the opening sequence just gets additional pieces of different alien societies and beings like fighting with the ship in the opening credits, and someone I didn't get the significance of the giant green glowing hand and, that being from that TOS episode, for example. And, I like that kind of layered on callback of the humor that has been there since the start. They just keep growing it.
In an era of TV, in an era of TV where the opening credit sequence is almost extinct, Star Trek keeps it alive.
It does, yeah. That music really helps sell it. Like it kind of puts you in the zone. I mean, that's a really, I know we talked about the music, but like, yeah, it's a really great open soundtrack. And I think it helps put you in the zone to have that with it too. Cool. Oh, are there any alien species, societies, or whatever that show up in this series that you would like to see come up in the future in another Star Trek?
Oh, I mean, I want to see the cetacean homeworld.
Ooh.
I would like a post-scarcity ocean planet run by whales.
I thought those were human whales. I thought they were like Earth whales.
Oh, okay.
But that doesn't mean
That's
I'm right. But I just interpret them to be like, this is what happens when humans and whales finally are able to communicate.
Okay. Then like a Jacques Cousteau in-universe documentary about whale society on Earth. Give me that.
Ooh, I love it. Yeah, I would be all about that. They're very cool. And in terms of other series, like I think the idea of centering something that isn't on the command folks is itself worth replicating. Do something with the diplomatic corps, do something with the spy, Section 31, which it seems like there's going to be like a Section 31 series now in the Discovery verse, right?
Yeah, that I've seen that it's going to be a movie, and as much as I love Michelle Yeoh, it seems like it's trying very hard to be cool, and I don't think it's Star Trek's place to be cool. It needs to be dorky and caring and sentimental. Like that's when it's at its best. When it's trying to be awesome, it becomes J.J. Abrams' Trek, and those are fun, but it's not what has made me been in love with the franchise for 30 some years.
Yeah. It's like we can get those other things from other series.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think that it would be cool to have an animated series that has a different animation feel to it. I don't think we'd get it. We'd probably only going to get uglier, because that's how these bosses seem to want to play things. But I don't know. I just don't understand why this show got canceled right now. I would have thought it would be affordable to make relatively.
Yeah, I don't understand the calculus that a lot of these streamers are doing in their heads. How they're canceling some projects, sometimes even before they're released, for various tax write-off purposes, and I don't understand, like even the release schedule of some of the seasons of Lower Decks and Strange New Worlds. How like one would be like they would change it so that like the premiere of one series would overlap with the season finale of another, and it seems like, why don't you just like wait a week so that you're not eating your own audience? Like it seems like a show like this does nothing but bring in goodwill.
Yeah. Well, John, thank you for joining us. I would like to give a little plug to your other podcast stuff, because we didn't really kick that off in the top of the episode.
My regular podcast gig is Popcorn Eschaton that I do with my good friend Scott Thurow. It's on the Zebras in America feed. We tackle religion and politics in film, whether that's explicit in the movie or whether we sort of project that onto it. So we've done episodes on Leon Marin Priest, as well as the 1986 Transformers animated movie. So we run the gamut with this thing, and we go deep but also have fun. And I'm having a great time.
Smarter than you began as well.
I like to think so.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Had some big Star Trek news of your own, John.
Yeah, I was thrilled to be a guest host on the Mission Log podcast, which is like Roddenberry Productions' official Star Trek podcast. One of the co-hosts, Norman Lau, is on medical leave, so the other co-host, John Champion, invited me on to be his co-host for the Star Trek Voyager episode 1159. And it was a great time. We talked about municipal planning and
Yes.
And how maybe in an interesting parallel with the final episode, how different versions of ourselves can help us, look at our own stories.
Yeah, that's for real. Like, you brought so much to my understanding of this Voyager episode. I think it's a really great episode of the show to listen to. So folks should definitely check that out. And I hope they have you on.
Yeah, it's a real
again.
Self-contained one. Yeah. So thank you so much. I really appreciate that. Thank you for listening.
And where can our followers keep up with you on social media?
Yeah, I'm on Instagram and Blue Sky at Quasar Sniffer. And if you're ever in central Pennsylvania, come by Comics Connection, where you can talk my ear off about comics, and I'll tell you what comics to buy.
I want to thank our listeners. We got some new reviews on the podcast apps. It really makes a big difference to helping support our work when you do that. So please keep that up. I am active on Blue Sky, which has been a great place to spend time with other people, make connections, talk about comics, art, and also tap into different activists and organizing opportunities happening in the real world right now, where we've got Amazon workers on strike, Starbucks workers on strike, and other amazing opportunities to fight for change in the real world, despite the terrible situation we find ourselves in. I am on Blue Sky at LEV, as in Victor, IN. And as we like to say, keep it geeky.
Hey, thanks for watching the previous video from Graphic Policy Television. Just by watching, you help support our site. Thank you so much. Now, if you're watching these videos, you probably care about geeky things like movies, television, comic books, toys, games, video games, you name it. You can go and subscribe right now to our YouTube channel to stay in touch and catch all the new videos, or check out our website at graphicpolicy.com. There's a nice link on this end of the video. But as always, thank you for watching. Keep on rocking and keep it geeky.